begin. So hello and welcome to today's virtual Lunch and Learn, What About the T in 2SLGBTQIA, presented by the Varley Art Gallery and sponsored by the Varley-McKay Art Foundation of Markham and the TD Bank Group. I am Public Program Coordinator at the Varley. My name is Rachel Fell and my pronouns are she, her. I am grateful to be in the gallery today, which is located on the Rouge River watershed in York Region. As a settler on this land, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional territories of Indigenous people and their commitment to stewardship of the land. We acknowledge the communities in circle, the north, west, south, and eastern direction, and Haudenosaunee, Huron-Wendat, Anishinaabe, Seneca, Chippewa, and the current treaty holders, Mississauga of the Credit Peoples. We share the responsibility with the caretakers of this land to ensure the dish is never empty and to restore relationships that are based on peace, friendship, and trust. We, the staff at the Varley and the City of Markham, are committed to reconciliation, partnership, and enhanced understanding. Thank you. Now for some quick housekeeping notes. Live captioning will be available throughout the talk. You can turn that on. The program is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel, so make sure you check us out over on YouTube. And finally, at the end of the presentation, we'll be taking questions from the audience. Feel free to share your thoughts with us in the Q&A box below, and we will do our best to answer as many questions as we can. Now, I'd like to introduce you to today's moderator, Marissa Largo.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you, Rachel, for that lovely introduction. And thank you to the Varley Art Gallery of Markham, particularly Anik Glode, who's the main curator there. I'm the guest curator of Elusive Desires, Ness and Florence. I'm thrilled to be facilitating this month's Lunch and Learn, which is part of public programming for the exhibition. Just first, a little bit about the exhibition. Elusive Desires traces the intimacies and belongings of two queer Asian diasporic artists, Ness and Florence. The artist's desires, affects, and are embodied through illustration, painting, installation, embroidery, and sculpture, and visualize gendered, sexual, and racial difference, but do so in alluring and sometimes ironic ways. Elusive Desires seeks to create a space in which the subjectivities and intimacies of queer Asian diaspora that are so often obscured by regimes of conformity and normativity under white supremacy are brought to the fore. Elusive Desires speculates, can we imagine other and more ethical ways of being in the world that embrace sexual, gendered, and racial difference? And can a queer, feminist, Asian diasporic lens help us to see these possibilities more vividly in the visual arts, in Canada at large and its institutions? And how can marginalized identities, including trans people, feel more valued in these spaces? Transphobia has been glaringly present in recent popular culture. David Chappelle's latest comedy special for Netflix, and thankfully it's his last, was ridden with exploitative anecdotes of the late trans comedian Daphne Dorman and other injurious jokes about trans people that added fuel to the already burning transphobic fire in post-Trump US. Chappelle's final call to the queer and trans community to, quote, stop punching down on my people, his people meaning Black people, erases the existence of queer and trans people of color, people who are often subjected to violence on a day-to-day basis. Here in Canada, just last week, Canada's award-winning author, Margaret Atwood, shared Rosie DiManno's problematic op-ed titled, quote, why can't we say woman anymore? A piece that critiques inclusive language in healthcare. This was circulated to her thousands of followers and thankfully met with rage by prominent activists, journalists, and community members. For a feminist author whose works of fiction show the horrors of biological essentialism, Her tweet was disappointing, damaging, and evidences harmful sentiments that pit feminism against transfeminism. Intersectional oppression requires intersectional approaches to tackle them. As cultural practice is about expression and communication, Elusive Desires and its programming adds a promising and hopeful voice and vision to this discourse. So in the spirit of making space for those who are on the margins of the margins, this Lunch and Learn provides a platform for emerging practitioners who are making vital interventions in the fields of museum studies and contemporary art. Our first speaker is Amelia Smith. Amelia Smith, pronouns she, her, is a transgender lesbian emerging museum professional. Her work seeks to bridge the gap between trans studies and museum studies, revealing what the museum field can learn from a transgender perspective. She began this work during her Master's of Museum Studies at U of T, resulting in her first exhibition, Transition-Related Surgery, The Fight for Access, on the history of gender-affirming surgery in Ontario. She sits on an advisory committee for the Transition-Related Surgery Department at Women's College Hospital. Currently, she is developing an exhibition for the Transgender Archives at the University of Victoria. Her writings can be found on her website, notyouravagesistery.com. And with great pleasure, please welcome Amelia. Thank you so much.
Hello. Thank you for having me. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And I will just share my screen. So, as was mentioned, I'm a transgender museum professional looking into trans museum studies and how these two fields can really coexist and what can be gained from looking at them together. Unfortunately, museums are only really just starting to question what it means. What does transgender mean in a museum space? For the longest time, transness was just basically a box to be checked on queer exhibits, not really considered how these things can be influenced, how they can be read and understood in different ways. So it was not really being developed very much. And it's only now really that we're seeing some changes, but it's happening very, very slowly. And I want to start with this quote from Museums, Sexuality and Gender Activism, which gives a definition of transness as males who wish to present themselves as females or females who wish to present themselves as males. This book, the book that this comes from, only came out last year in 2020, and it effectively misgenders trans people. And the especially sad thing is that this book is one of the very, very few that even tries to talk about transness in any kind of real sense. Unfortunately, this does not mean that there are no conversations around trans exhibits, but unfortunately they are being done outside of museum spaces. They're being done in journals such as the Transgender Studies Quarterly, where they are separate from museums. And while these discussions are fantastic through the exhibition, through for example, Asato Ikeda's article on curating a third gender, the exhibit at the Royal Ontario Museum some years ago, these are often separate and they're not so often being found unless people go looking for them specifically. And instead, it's things like this that misgender, that completely misinterpret what it means to be trans. So we're seeing a change, but for that change to really happen, there needs to be significant reworks for exhibitions and for museums to actually welcome trans people. They need to be doing more. And unfortunately, what we often see with exhibits, we often see temporary changes. We see temporary exhibits or talks or things that they don't often really open the door for transformative change, for actual institutional change that can actually make trans people feel more included. An example of this sort of change that is really necessary is at the Royal Ontario Museum again, with their non-gendered washroom, which, unlike most institutions, their non-gendered washroom is multi-stalled. It is not just a repurposed disabled bathroom. It actually allows for multiple people to be in there, and it puts it on the same level as their gendered washrooms, which is exceptionally necessary. And it signals to trans people that their existence in these institutions is accepted and welcomed. But unfortunately, this is the example. It is not the general rule that has been seen. Most institutions there are opportunities to have trans conversations. There are opportunities to expand interpretations, but unfortunately, they often require a very deep, very large reinterpretation effort, going through and rethinking on all of the galleries, all of the spaces that are in place, and inquiring what can be different. Unfortunately, these sorts of changes don't come around very often. And when they do, they can still be hit by biases and questions about what does it mean? Can we tell these stories? And it absolutely is possible to tell these stories, but oftentimes there are biases. People just decide not to tell them. They think that no one's interested, or that to tell them is to be biased. But telling these stories can be very significant. And one of the arguments that comes up against it is that these are new terms. Talking about transness is something that would be ahistorical, that it cannot be applied to previous eras. And I think this is a somewhat absurd claim, because it's not unheard of to apply terms to the past. To quote Leah Devon in The Shape of Sex, talking about non-binary examples of identity, of being in the medieval period, they did not use the language of transgender, nor would they have recognized that concept. But we often use contemporary terms to describe past individuals and societies that lack our modern language. After all, no one used the word medieval in the Middle Ages. So there exists this bias in talking about these discussions, having these discussions, because we see transness and a lot of queer identities as being ahistorical, as being in our time. And to apply them to the past is to be doing bad history. But what we can see more and more coming out from trans studies and trans historians is this need to view transness less as a identity and sometimes more as a lens to view history, so that we can pull apart these narratives that have been forged in heteronormative, through heteronormative lenses, and explore the other ways of looking at things to see what else can be revealed, what else can be found. And it's absolutely important. It's necessary to do this, to really make museums and to make these spaces more accepting, more inclusive, because without them, oftentimes, trans people are not going to feel welcome. They're not going to be interested in going to institutions multiple times until they can feel welcome. And I think that ended up being a lot shorter than I anticipated, but that is everything. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Amelia. That was a lovely presentation. Our next speaker is Excel Garay. Pronouns are they, them, siya. Is a Filipina-Canadian diasporic settler occupying Mi'kmaqui territory in Halifax, Nova Scotia. They are Bakla, a term reserved for trans-femme that is often considered a third gender in the Philippines. Throughout their childhood, they were immersed in Cebuano culture, tradition, and ways of being. Garay is an expanded media painter and cultural worker. They are interested in unraveling the many invisible, spiritual, environmental, economic, political, cultural, social, and cosmological contradictions that lead post-colonial subjects like them into colonial complicity and complacency. These contradictory topics materially manifest through paintings, ready-made objects, and immersive installations, and more. As a trans-postcolonial subject, their interests lie in contradictions as well as incommensurable situations in everyday occurrences, with focuses on fugitivity, time, and labor. Hauntings, melodrama, and feelings of embarrassment under a queer necropolitical lens foreground their practice. Please welcome with me, Excel Garay.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for that lovely introduction, Marissa, and that lovely presentation. Yeah, I'm very excited to be here and do my presentation, and I will share my screen. Hi, folks. My name is Excel Garay. My pronouns are they, them, or she, her, or siya in Filipino. I am a Filipina-Canadian diasporic settler occupying Mi'kmaqui territory. This is the home and ancestral land of the Mi'kmaq people. The Treaty of Peace and Friendship of 1752 between the British Crown and the Wabanaki Confederation did not deal with the giving up of indigenous land and ways of being. As fellow settlers, we must keep in mind that our presence here as colonial entities does not undo the infrastructures that are already there, which targets and displaces indigenous peoples. However, knowing and respecting the region-specific treaties, working with grassroots organizations, and uplifting land and water protectors are vital, important starting points. I want to start off this presentation with a poem by Audre Lorde from The Black Unicorn. And when the sun rises, we are afraid it might not remain. When the sun sets, we are afraid it might not rise in the morning. When our stomachs are full, we are afraid of indigestion. When our stomachs are empty, we are afraid we may never eat again. When we are loved, we are afraid love will vanish. When we are alone, we are afraid love will never return. And when we speak, we are afraid. Our words will not be heard, nor welcome. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. So it is better to speak, remembering we were never meant to survive. I want to start off and thank you, my family. This is a photo of my mother, Marissa Garay, and my two sisters right beside her. On the left is Christine Sige and Rika Sige Garay on the right. I am Bakla. It is a term reserved for trans-femmes, which is often considered a third gender in the Philippines. The gender Bakla cannot be foregrounded in Western conceptions or preconceptions of gender. It goes beyond the confines of the terms L, G, B, E, and Q. For now, the closest term in English that resembles it is queer, but it denotes hyper-feminine behavior, and depending on its use, it could also act as a slur. So it's an identity that's based on a very specific framework that developed there. It doesn't, it cannot function in how we use gendered terms that's predominant in our everyday life, especially here in Turtle Island. Even the term, even the meaning is not correct, because I personally heard the term being used as a descriptor among cis Philippine women. They use it to describe endearing, campy, hyper-feminine behavior, or even as a way to tell each other that they're beautiful. So you can see that it could be used as a slur, but depending on how it's used, it could also be a compliment as well. Gender variance exists all over the world in many cultures. A lot of queer folks from the West would be surprised by that, because usually we think of things so fragmentally or categorically as a byproduct of Eurocentrism. We think in broken ways, and at the same time inflict that same brokenness in various parts of the world. As Marissa Largo mentioned, I am an expanded media painter and cultural worker. Hauntings, melodrama, and feelings of embarrassment under a queer necropolitical lens foregrounds my own art practice. So necropolitics is a very specific lens coined by Achille Mbembe, who was a Cameroonian philosopher. He asserts that the world is separated by those that are destined to live and those that are destined to die. Unraveling who gets to live and who gets to die reveals the machinations of how this world truly operates, from state-sanctioned deaths, state-sanctioned abandonments, and multi-level institutional failures. My art practice, the color ultramarine blue has fully hypnotized me. It's an amazing deep sea blue that's both alluring and repellent at the same time. The term ultramarine, from the color ultramarine blue, originated from the Latin term ultramarinus, which means from beyond the seas. It references the highly extracted mineral called lapis lazuli, which is known to decorate the body of the Holy Virgin Mary, especially during the Renaissance period. Most of the mineral originates from across the sea inside the mines of Afghanistan. Due to scarcity, it is no longer sustainable to use the expensive lapis lazuli as the main ingredient to create the hypnotic color blue to meet modern cultural demands. These days, synthetic ultramarine is composed of various minerals to emulate its original predecessor. The synthetic cousin is non-toxic. The production of this composition, which was invented by Jean-Baptiste Guémet in 1826, continuously produces a variety of toxic fumes and waste. Through this color, I wish to communicate feelings of melodrama, hauntings, fugitivity, invisible labor, unstable time, and many oscillating, transitioning changes. I would like to read these two quotes that have fully captured me as well by Ocean Vuong on Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous. To be a monster is to be a hybrid signal, a lighthouse, both shelter and warning at once. And by Octavia Butler from Parable of the Sower. All that you change, all you touch, you change. All that you change changes you. The only lasting truth is change. So here is a painting that I've done. It is titled Bayot with a Teardrop Earring. The title of this painting references the Baroque painting tradition of naming, like Girl with a Pearl Earring. But the term bayot is a Bisaya or Cebuano term specific for Bakla, the third gender. In this painting, you can see a figure represented by rushed and focused swirls of paint. Their body is then outlined by translucent ultramarine blue paint. The body was then interrupted by meticulous slicings to allow weavings of the same material to be woven onto their body. I'm interested in portraying the bayot or bakla body as ever-changing or ever malleable, but also as flexible as the environment. Their bodies can always accept and welcome new narratives to weave and become part of the self. I think it's always been a ridiculous notion that our bodies are separated from our environments, which is a byproduct of the Enlightenment's romanticization of nature as a sublime force that is in binary opposition of patriarchal Western civilization. During pre-colonial times, gender variants have always been part and played integral roles in their respective civilizations. Bakla, bayot, or aji were often welcomed as babaylans, who were once community leaders, doctors, archivers, and spiritual elders that mediate between the material and spiritual world. It's a specific role that belongs only to women and feminine gender variants. There's a popular oral tradition from my region that talks about the violence inflicted on the babaylan. To successfully convert the natives in so-called Philippines to Christianity, the babaylan had to be erased. One of the most horrifying tales passed down was that they were chopped up and fed to the crocodiles by the Spanish. For this painting, it's called Mga Nanawag og Laing Kalibutan. In English, it translates to those who call for another world. The painting manifests in between abstraction and figuration, both hidden at first, then only visible when you focus on them. Once you see the figures, you will see two of them laying down, reaching for the black void in the center. I wanted to create this painting to communicate the many liminalities trans-postcolonial subjects are subjected to. It captures my diasporic longings and desire for another world. I painted ambiguous figures called Diliingon Nato, which means not like us humans from Cebuano folklore. These beings occupy spaces between multiple man-made dichotomies. In Mga Nanawag og Laing Kalibutan, the unraveling figures are ambiguously rendered through paint, while their environment is interrupted by meticulous slicings through the canvas, with similar materials woven in. These woven and unwoven characteristics, gestures to how their ability to shift forms, transition, allow them to connect and disconnect with others, while disrupting the spaces they occupy. In this composition, whiteness only exists at the margins. For many of those who occupy multiple spaces of liminalities, it has always been a spiritual desire to be able to temporarily separate from our limited bodies, whether that's dissociating or something spiritual. This allows us to see the various hidden forces at play in which we are implicated in, which continuously affect tropical and subtropical regions, as well as the unceded land we occupy. For this composition, I was drawn to our bad habit of potting up exotic tropical plants in these common mass-produced urns that you often see at home, offices, or banks. So I decided to prop the painting onto 2 colonial ultramarine blue urns. Since like the tropical home, the houseplants, the painting becomes decorative after losing its habitat. The painting is barely supported by the urns, by the Western colonial urns, and barely leaning against the wall. It speaks to its constant state of precarity of when it gets supported and why. I want to subtly ask the viewers who benefit from these houseplants, who benefits from the stories that someone like me, convey, and when it is so far removed from its original context. Here is a close-up of the slicing and the weavings. The many symbols on the painting is actually a mixture of 4 scripts that I had access to while growing up in the Philippines. So here on the top left, you have the cursive letterings of Roman letters that originated from European traditions. On the right, you have the Japanese hiragana letterings. At the bottom, you have the native baybayin lettering. And on the right at the very bottom, you have the letterings for Badlit, which is a Visayan script. I wanted to mix them all together until they simultaneously lose their original meanings. And I wanted to convey a state of always constantly questioning. Because I find that the Filipino identity is often determined by a transnational lens, where it's always at a precarious state due to movement of resources and peoples all over the world. So those are 2 examples of past works. Currently, I have an upcoming group show that I co-curated with Luba Gonzalez de Armas. It is titled The Tropical Gothic. So it was first coined in 1972 by Filipino author Nick Joaquin. The term Tropical Gothic came from a compilation of fictional short stories titled Tales of the Tropical Gothic. This literary work is a result of a historical moment of tumultuous social transitions because of colonial forces violating autochthonous cultures. In Joaquin's work, the Tropical Gothic as a nascent genre resists the imperialist ideology of its European predecessor, infusing indigenous Philippine ex-folklore, ways of knowing and doing and imaginaries into the Anglophone literary canon. The Gothic as a literary movement was born of European fears of the unknown. The Gothic summons imagery of cold, bleak, arid landscapes and castles or manors filled with melodramatic characters. Common themes in these settings are the sublime, romanticism, nebulous nocturnal forces, and the demonic antagonist other. Conversely, tropicality invokes colonialist and escapist fantasies of sunny beaches, villas, jungles, plantations, and pleasures in regions of the global south. For this exhibition titled The Tropical Gothic, these nocturnal and solar visions paradoxically come together to shatter hegemonic narratives. So this was first conceptualized by me in my obsession with ultramarine blue, because I invited the participating artists, Calmera Farabaksh, Shaya Ishak, Pamela Juarez, Cynthia Arias Auz, Marissa Sean Cruz, to speak to the color of ultramarine blue and their versions of the Tropical Gothic. Right now, I'm doing, here's our samples of work in progress for the Tropical Gothic as well as future exhibitions. All of the extracted materials, resources, cultures, and stuff are, everything has been colored ultramarine blue to speak from that transnational queer necropolitical lens. Yeah, so I really wanted to freeze time with these fake objects. Something that I'm also doing at the moment is trying to get in touch with recycled materials right now, where I'm taking and chopping up packagings and weaving it into the Visayan tradition or Cebuano tradition of weaving materials and recycling materials from things from packages that would envelop all of these objects. Yeah, so these are my primary works at the moment and that I'm very excited to deploy. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Excel. That was wonderful to see your curatorial practice and your creative arts practice and its intersections with Bakla identity and transnational questions of queerness and culture. At this point, we will open up the Q&A function to audience members. So if you would like to ask our panelists questions from their talks today, please feel free to write it in the Q&A function. But I will get things started. So Amelia and Excel, I invite you to turn on your cameras and we'll get the conversation going. So thank you once again for such a generous talk and a sharing of your practice in museum studies and visual arts. My first question is about language and inclusivity. So Amelia, you talked about the importance of language, a transgender language in art history, and how that is often, the word that you used was ahistorical. Excel, you talked about the nuances of Bakla identity and how that's really, there's really no equivalent translation in English, and how that is a very specific linguistic and cultural term to capture a sensibility. And so I'm wondering, how can our institutional contexts, whether they are the museum, the archive, the gallery, the university, the studio, how can our institutional contexts adopt a more inclusive language that is more responsive to sexual, gender, and racial difference, and also evidence of valuing of trans people?
So I would say an important part would be to have trans people present for discussions. If nothing else, having them as copy editors and seeing how these discussions are happening, ensuring that they get paid as well, and it's not unpaid labor. But additionally, having trans people at the table and having them be able to give their voice to decision making, not just once everything is going up, but actually deciding how these things get described, how they get interpreted, I think is also incredibly important.
Thank you, Amelia.
I also agree with Amelia as well. Having trans people, marginalized identities at decision-making positions can effectively change how an institution functions. But something that I also notice that could be done is potentially not speak for each other, because without knowing each other's contexts, because that's also very essentialist. And part of the reason why we've arrived in this context is a tendency for a lot of people who do not occupy that framework or worldview speaks for another. And that's where things get lost.
Mhm. Those are wonderful points. I'm going to turn to the Q&A function. And the first question is actually from one of the two amazing artists of Elusive Desires, Florence Yi. Pronouns are they, them. And Florence asks a question to you, Excel. You have such a well-researched practice. Do you also center community through that research, or do you prefer keeping those separate in different spheres?
I'm keeping it separate for the moment, but there was a time where I did community and institutional intervention in an exhibition called Breach that talks about the performativity of virtual virtue signaling of institutions to convey superficial progressiveness by adapting and reifying and using and abusing bodies through tokenistic approaches, where it's simply short-term optics and not long-term change. So that's something that I have done for Breach. I could probably link it in the chat, not right now, an article about this, but yeah. And I'm also a community organizer and program coordinator for a not-for-profit and nonpartisan organization. Nonpartisan is weird, but I just wanted to say that. But yeah, it's engaging. I'm a program coordinator for this organization called Apathy is Boring. And we engage with youth to take on community leadership roles. Yeah.
Thank you, Excel. I'm going to reframe that question for Amelia as well. Amelia, you have a fantastic blog, and it is really cutting edge. It is contributing to the changing discourse in museum studies, which you have, and many have, critiqued as being very Eurocentric and cisgendered. Can you talk a little bit about your blog as a community intervention amongst the trans community, and also in the academic field of museum studies?
Certainly. So my blog, notyouraveragehistory.com, is an extension of work that I was doing while at my master's. I was writing a column for the student blog Musings under the same name, Not Your Average History, that looked at bridging the gap between trans studies and museum studies, because I had found, when I started the degree, I went in looking for what others had said on trans museums, and I found next to nothing. I found one article that basically said transness is basically just slapped on at the end, not really considered for the whole narrative. More often than not, the T is often invisible. And that really encouraged me to start looking at ways that these two fields, trans studies and museum studies, can be melded and how they can respond to each other. And after graduating, my website became a way to continue to do that, to continue thinking on this topic that is so desperately needed, and offer these new voices to come out to look at how we can see things differently. And I think that I've had experiences where people have said that they've read my work before I've known them, which gives an inclination of where this has been going and that this voice has been necessary.
That's, yeah, I mean, that's, I myself have learned so much from your blog. You know, as a professor, it adds to my repertoire on queer and trans museum studies that I didn't, that I wasn't familiarized in my training. So those interventions are vital for the next generation of scholars and curators. I also liked how you talked about how the museum is making structural changes in terms of gender inclusive washrooms, like the Royal Ontario Museum, which I believe was one of the first museums to institute that. The next question is from Niamh Olera, who is the director of the Varley Art Gallery of Markham. And she asks, could Amelia and Excel talk a bit more about specific things that galleries could do to become more welcoming and inclusive for the trans community?
I would say, first and foremost, is reaching out to them in ways that they would respond to, not going in with the assumption of we are going to use this to make an exhibition, but to actually further the community in some way. Because so often museums come in as institutional, as institutions to discuss, to set up, just to take knowledge. And if we want to see real change, there needs to be more than that. There needs to be actual commitments that go beyond the time frame that an exhibit would be going up.
Hi. Oh, Marissa, you're muted.
Sorry, thanks. I just wanted to add to Amelia's fantastic point that institutions really need to avoid those extractionist tendencies to take from communities. Go ahead, Excel.
Yeah, I also feel the same way because the goal is not for short-term optics, short-term extractive optics. The goal is to work with these communities. And sometimes there's a lot of problems that will arise that cannot be specifically portrayed as of now. And I think having folks, again, at decision-making bodies for institutional change to happen is incredibly important. This is not short-term anything, this is long-term overhaul. And that also includes rethinking how institutions will operate and how they behave around community.
Thank you. My next question is about an ethic of care. So the exhibition Elusive Desires is about creating a hospitable present and future for folks who do not conform to the norm. Situated in Markham, which very much presents itself as upwardly mobile and hetero and kind of like that the nuclear family. And so in this space, this exhibition is an intervention in that it shows these unconventional forms of belonging, how, you know, we can think about transnational kinship, we can think about queer and trans relationships. And so in Ness's work, they create this beautiful embrace using this wave in the gallery so that it's creating space, but also holding space for others. And similarly, Florence creates these gestures of reciprocity as symbolized in tangerine peels, which is a Cantonese hospitality practice. And so I'm thinking about hospitality and an ethic of care, and how do you demonstrate those in your work, in your activism, in your scholarship, in your creative practice? And
I
it could
mean-
be, yeah.
For me, I'd say that it comes down to just trying to create a seat at the table. Because for so often in museum studies, there hasn't been a seat at the table. Museums are colonial institutions. They come out of a colonial worldview that is still incredibly present. And my work, I just try to make sure that there is a space that queer people, trans people can feel like they do belong, that they are welcome, and that we can find areas for existence, even in these hospitals, even in places that might seem unwelcoming.
Thank
I
you.
want to give an example of what happened pre-pandemic. So we have an art bar in NASCAD University, and through the queer collective, which I'm not part of now, but I was part of it for NASCAD Queer Collective. A lot of the leaders were trans people, and they wanted to showcase a wonderful event where there's dance, party, but also a drag event. And so far, it has been the most successful event of attracting many, many, many people, especially the queer community, because it was led, and a lot of the decision-making bodies were led by Renkan Morris that I see in the chat here. And Maddie Alexander and Brody Weaver. So you have this give and take relationship of a community that offers a space for the same or similar community. Nobody speaks for each other, you know? And this event was so incredibly successful that the art bar was overflowing with people, and it was great. There's a lot of documentation involved.
I wish I could have been there. Hopefully we can return to those art events soon, very soon. I'm going to, I think we have we have time for one more question. Here is last chance from our audience to ask a question. No takers. Okay, well, I have a question to just kind of wrap things up. I'm looking ahead to the calendar. November 20th is the Trans Day of Remembrance. And if we think about historical queer and trans liberation movements like Stonewall, they were very much led by trans folks, and particularly trans folks of color. And so, commemoration is about, bringing to mind those that have been lost along the way, the sacrifices that have been made, but it's also about celebration. So I'm wondering, what are the ways in which you and your communities will mark the Trans Day of Remembrance? And for cisgendered allies like myself, what are things that we can do to either spread awareness or commemorate or celebrate?
I would say now more than ever, we need to speak up about transphobia because there are increasingly voices that are speaking up against trans people. I believe just yesterday, the BBC in the UK posted a horrible transphobic conspiracy theory about trans women trying to pressure lesbians into having sex. And especially in the UK, things are very bad institutionally with transphobia, with TERFs getting into high positions in organizations. And these things directly lead to trans suicides. And we need to call it out as we see it. We need to actually address it. Because if we don't, it's not going to get better. We are not going to get through this unless we actually vocalize our distaste for these actions. Like with Dave Chappelle's comedy special, we need to actually get out there and make our voices heard. And trans people alone cannot do this. We do need the help of cisgender allies, because on our own, we aren't that many. But together we can make a change. We can actually do something.
Absolutely. And to rephrase Audre Lorde's words that Excel shared in their presentation, our words will not be heard, that our silence needs to be broken.
Yeah, I don't really have a planned event for that specific day, because right now I'm more invested in my own trans group and community. Maybe that's also just but I am doing a lot of these NTO workshops in various organizations, but also in the role in my own job. Something that I find it difficult has been finding a lot of hope lately in terms of a lot of these intersecting things and interconnected things and interconnected frameworks. So I'm becoming more invested in my own community as well as the people that I love. But also, this is just a reminder that every day is Trans Day of Remembrance. It's not just that specific nationalist day. So I think it's more important to really look into ourselves. If many folks identify as allies, is to hold your close friends and your immediate surroundings accountable, because that is where everything starts, interior, and those people that we have access to. Because let's face it, it's very difficult for trans people to have access to many, many things. And yeah, we need your voice.
Thank you so much, Excel and Amelia. What a wonderful conversation about museum studies, trans studies, Filipinx visual art, and Bakla cultural production. I think I'm going to turn it over now to Rachel, and thank you once again for joining us for this Lunch and Learn. Rachel? As we're waiting for Rachel, there are two questions. Actually some information regarding a remembrance event for Trans Day of Remembrance from CAYR, Community Connections, from Jennifer Silk. And I believe that there will be more information on their Instagram, or you could reach out to Jennifer Silk at cayrcc.org for more information. Rachel, are you there? Okay, we might have lost Rachel. So I will close up. Rachel, are you joining us now? On behalf of the Varley Art Gallery of Markham, thank you so much, Amelia Smith and Excel Garay, for being here, for sharing virtual space with myself. It has been a pleasure and honor. I've followed your practices for a while now, and I'm incredibly inspired creatively and academically by both of your practices. Please continue your work with with your interventions in queer and trans justice and liberation. Thanks again to the Varley Art Gallery of Markham for making space for Elusive Desires. It is a fantastic exhibition. Ness and Florence transform the gallery space to create a soft, inclusive space where queer Asian diasporic visualities are at the center to convey an ethic of care. It is open till January 2022, so do please check it out. Have a great rest of the day, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, folks. Thank you so much, Marissa, Amelia.
Thank you. Salamat.
Salamat.
Thank you, everyone.